a state of war would exist between us, and that consequently this country is at war with Germany.
The free men of the world are marching together to victory. I have full confidence in your courage, devotion to duty, and skill in battle. We will accept nothing less than full victory. Good luck, and let us all beseech the blessing of Almighty God upon this great and noble undertaking.
The definition or underlining of the term hero is a someone who is admired for their courage, achievements, noble sacrifices, and ability to stare adversity in the face without a single blink. It's important to point out that there are many unsung heroes, those never publicly recognized as heroes because they never had the spotlight or the opportunity to share their stories. Sadly, some of these stories will be lost in time as the last of our World War II veterans fade away. Some are not lucky to make it back, as well the ones that hold that heavy heart being a survivor. Some of these stories have been tucked away in attics, forgotten, undiscovered, or never known to the general public. These brave individuals belonged to the greatest generation of mankind and must be remembered. Their sacrifice must not be lost or forgotten for what they had done for us and freedom we get to enjoy because of them. We are going to embark on telling a story about another unsung hero from Hastings County. But we must first start here.
Deloro is a small hamlet in southeastern Ontario, just north of the Trans-Canada Highway between Toronto and Ottawa. This now quiet community was once a booming mining town. The resources once processed through here helped fuel Canada and her allies through both world wars. And it was here in Deloro, over 100 years ago, as the final chapters of the First World War were closing, that a son was born to Harry and Beatrice Loveless. Unknown to the Lovelesses on that March 2nd back in 1919, their tiny newborn Floyd would one day put everything he had on the line for his country. Floyd, who went by the name Bud, went to elementary school in Deloro before attending high school in the nearby village of Marmora. He was athletic and enjoyed all types of sports, including tennis and baseball. And like many young men growing up in the 1920s in rural Ontario, Bud whiled away his winters playing ice hockey on frozen ponds. There are a couple of interesting things about this school photo taken in 1935 at Marmora High School. Not only are 3 Loveless children in the photo, Bud, his brother Jim, and sister Marjorie, but also in this picture is Bud's future wife, Rita. It was during the 1930s, while attending high school in nearby Marmora, that Bud and his younger brother Jim played competitive hockey with the Marmora Arctic Owls, a team that would compete in tournaments across eastern Ontario. Miss Jenny Farley remembers her time as a teacher at Marmora High School during the 30s, including the fun times that were had during the winter.
I recall the hockey practices, particularly Floyd Loveless and Bert Coorey. At the time, Marmora had no skating rink, but I had a little green coop. The whole team would climb in or on. If you hung on tight, the running boards made for fine transportation, and off we went to the Deloro rink. I can think of myself laughing when a hockey player, stick and all, tried to ride sitting on the engine. But that proved too cumbersome. We stopped, he slid off, and somehow squeezed into the rumble seat, already crowded, and off we went again.
The hockey season is officially on.
Our team, with no sub-player whatsoever, did very well.
Both played sensational hockey.
Teacher, Miss Jenny Farley.
Following high school, Bud worked briefly as an electrician for the burgeoning mine in Deloro, which at the time was a major employer in the local region. Bud's future wife, Rita Johnson, worked in the main office at the mine in the early 1940s.
Took me to his workshop and told his plans to me.
Christmas morning 1940 is one that Bud and Rita will never forget.
And it was his coming to town.
2nd of January, 1941. Cars collide head-on. A serious auto accident occurred at Chatterton on number 14 highway Christmas morning. Floyd Loveless of Deloro had driven to Belleville to bring his sister, Miss Marjorie Loveless, registered nurse, home for Christmas. He was accompanied by Miss Rita Loveless, and Miss Gladys Guillen was also a passenger in the car, on her way to Marmor to spend the holidays at her home.
Fog and snow screening the view. They were involved in a head-on collision. Bud's sister Marjorie Loveless, a nurse, was uninjured and used her skills to care for the wounded. But despite these injuries, Tim Black says his father-in-law was determined to be a pilot, and having a wounded knee from a car crash a year earlier actually played to Bud's advantage when he showed up at the airbase in Trenton to volunteer.
He had a car accident just the year before that, so he had a bum knee, and he had a note from his doctor that he didn't have to, it wasn't necessary to get drafted or whatever at that time. So kind of made it quite clear that he wanted to be a pilot. They made it quite clear, well, you just don't walk in here and tell us that you want to be a pilot. And Bud told him, well, he says, I got a doctor's note here says I don't have to do anything, so I'm either going to be a pilot or I'm kind of walking. And he was actually on his way out the door, and they called him back and said, Mr. Loveless, I think we can work you into our program.
Very keen, sincere, and well-spoken. Writes good letter for his age. Lacking in self-confidence and possibly somewhat ill at ease. But I feel he has good stuff in him and should be given a chance. Recommended for pilot or observer. Signed, Squadron Leader J.O. Plummer.
General witness. Average, young lad with good appearance. Reserved and sincere. He made an application on July 17, 1940, but broke his leg in December 1940. Requested to report same month and unable to do so. He is keen to fly. He is a trade electrician in motors, condensers, etc. He should prove to be good aircrew after training. Recommended for pilot or observer. Signed, Flight Officer L.M. Jennison.
The starting point for many men was Manning Depot in Toronto, where they learned the basics of becoming a soldier. Bud was fortunate to be one of the airmen to train in Ontario and here locally. Bud spent time at CFB Trenton, undergoing basic airman training. Bud also underwent training at the initial training school in Belleville. The RCAF took over Sir James Whitney School for the Deaf in the early 1940s, providing a place for airmen to learn in the classroom before moving forward to the next phase of training.
This is my dad's logbook. He started training in 1942, and there's different entries that he's made in here for all his flights that he's done, all the planes that he's flown.
Bud would commence elementary flight training at number 10 Pendleton near Ottawa in 1942, starting on Link trainers before getting a shot at the more expensive warplanes that would get him in the skies over southern Ontario. After completing the elementary training school, Bud and his pal Mac Reeves were sent to Uplands in Ottawa to start their next phase of training. The skies over the Ottawa Valley had been abuzz with Harvards, Yales, and other trainers since a British Commonwealth Air Training School had been opened at Uplands in 1940. Bud, of course, was forced to leave his love behind. Rita had steady work in the office at the Deloro mine, but Bud did have company on the long drives back and forth to Ottawa for leave time. Mackenzie Reeves, just down the road in Madoc, was also training at Uplands. Some pleasant chatter on the way, 50-50 on fuel costs. Why not? Both had their reasons for wanting to get home whenever possible as well. Mac Reeves still owned a gas station in Marmora, and Bud, his reason, of course, was his girlfriend Rita Johnson. This was long before the time of email and instant messaging. But Tim Black says his father-in-law was able to get some messages to Rita pretty quickly.
Bud would fly the Harvards up from Ottawa, and I was telling you, he'd put the love letters, he'd write a love letter, and he'd tape it or elastic band it really hard to a rock, and fly over the Deloro mine and open the cockpit and throw these love letters out into and the guys would pick it up down in the pit and take it up to Rita, because he'd have it on the outside to Rita. And they'd hear the Harvards, because the Harvards were very loud. They could pitch their prop, and that was what made that noise, the carving. The Harvard had a very distinctive noise from any other aircraft. So, yeah, that was a pretty cool story. So,
Bud and his carpooling pal Mac Reeves graduated from basic flight school together, receiving their wings in a ceremony at RCAF Station Uplands.
Ottawa, March 19th. Group Captain F.A. Sampson, commanding officer of No. 2 Service Flying Training School at nearby Uplands, today presented wings to the graduating class of RCAF pilots. Among the Ontario graduates were Floyd Loveless, Deloro, and Mackenzie Reeves Madoc, who operated the Imperial Service Station here for some years, Mr. and Mrs. Harry Loveless, Deloro, Miss Marjorie Loveless, registered nurse, Montreal, and Miss Rita Johnson of Marmora. They were among those who attended the presenting of the wings.
Shortly after his graduation from flight school, Bud Loveless and Rita Johnson tied the knot in March of 1943 at St. Andrew's United Church in Peterborough. 2 days later, the young couple left for Manitoba, over 2,000 kilometers to the northwest, where Bud advanced his training at No. 3 Bombing and Gunnery School at RCAF Station McDonald, not far from Portage-la-Prairie. The number of flights Bud undertook advancing his flying skills at the airfield in McDonald, Manitoba was staggering, where he spent his time flying the Lysander, the Anson, and most frequently the Ferry battle plane. Jean-Paul Corbeil of Bonfield, Ontario, was on the 12th flight of his air gunner course. His pilot on that October 27th in 1943 happened to be Bud Loveless, the crew conducting a bomb test over the Manitoban skies. Corbeil was believed to be one of the few surviving air gunners to come back from the war that was trained at the Bombing and Gunnery School in McDonald, Manitoba. Corbeil mentioned how they flew on patched-up Ferry battle planes sent from England, an aircraft that was relegated to training duties due to its disastrous results as a light daytime bomber.
Oxide News. Bud Loveless has received his commission as pilot officer and is posting overseas.
Canadian Air Squadron, the Royal Canadian Air Force.
After many flight training hours in Canada, Bud departed the docks of Halifax in May of 1944 on the dangerous journey across the Atlantic Ocean, with German U-boats lurking in the waters below. These troop ships transported tens of thousands of Canadians overseas, fueling the Allied effort to crush the German war machine.
Hello, England. There's a great many of us here, and there's thousands more coming.
Bud made landfall in the southern English port of Bournemouth before beginning the next phase of flight training. Interestingly, as the entry and settlement point for thousands of Allied troops, Bournemouth was the target of dozens of German air attacks. In one raid in May of 1943, German bombers destroyed much of the town, killing over 130. Once in the United Kingdom, he started flying Miles master planes before being assigned to the Hawker Hurricane, on which he completed 22 flights. The Spitfire is one of the most famous warplanes ever built. Reginald J. Mitchell, an engineer from Staffordshire, developed the aircraft in 1936, basing the design on seaplanes. Over 22,000 Supermarine Spitfires were built, and they played a crucial role in pushing back the German aggressors and defending the Allies from the skies over occupied Europe during World War II. It was in November of 1944 when Bud finally got his first taste of the Supermarine Spitfire. He spent time at RAF Station Harden in Wales, a facility used to train reconnaissance pilots in the art of gathering intelligence about the enemy, the terrain and weather conditions, critical information used on the battlefield. And then it was off to RAF Andover, where he would continue to become familiar with the Spitfire, an aircraft on which he practiced aerobatics, low flying, pair flying, dogfighting, and flight evading. Tim Black says that his father-in-law knew the Spitfire intimately, as demonstrated one November day in 1944 over the skies of Burtonwood, Lancashire, England.
It was a brand new plane, and he's up and just got going, and a rod come right through the side of the, lost all his oil.
On November 17th, 1944, I was flying at 2,000 feet, speeds of 200 miles per hour using zero boost and 2,000 RPMs. Suddenly there was a loud backfire. White smoke poured from the engine, mostly from the port exhaust. The oil pressure started to drop off and the temperature increased rapidly, and the engine vibrated violently. I immediately throttled back, decreased the revs, but as the engine continued to vibrate and the smoke increased, I immediately decided to force land. There was an airfield about 3 miles away and I turned towards it. I was losing height and the cockpit was full of smoke. On the downwind leg at 1,000 feet, I selected wheels down approach at this point. My engine seized and smoke became more violent. I cut the switches, turned the fuel off, and made a normal glide approach. When I was sure of making runway, I selected flaps down and made a successful landing. The port flap was damaged slightly. I did not feel it hit. Signed, Pilot Officer F.R. Loveless.
An accident occurred involving Spitfire AB-364. The Spitfire was piloted by Pilot Officer F.R. Loveless on the 17th of November 1944. This was a very well executed forced landing, especially in view of the poor visibility at the time, 3 miles. Apart from the success of the glide approach and landing, the pilot must have thought coolly and intelligently to make the only airfield in the vicinity of 12 to 15 miles. He is strongly recommended for a green endorsement. This was a good effort. Signed, Wing Commander E. Plumtree, Officer Commanding Training Wing, 41 OTU, 19th of November 1944.
Lost all his oil, lost his engine completely, and he was able to land that plane dead stick, saved the aircraft. And there's a notation in his flight book here. about that, saving the aircraft.
Endorsement regarding good airmanship. December the 17th, 1944. Accident to Spitfire AB364. When flying in bad visibility, the engine of the faulty aircraft failed and temporarily caught on fire. He was able to locate an airfield and execute a skilled landing. Signed, Group Captain Commanding Officer Howard V. Alloway of No. 41 Operational Training Unit.
Have yourself
Over Christmas 1944, Bud wrapped up his photo reconnaissance flight training at Andover and flew his Spitfire across the English Channel, landing at an Allied-controlled airfield in the Netherlands.
Serving in Holland, Flying Officer Floyd Bud Loveless, overseas, son of Mr. and Mrs. Harry Loveless, DeLauro, wrote that he expected to meet his brother, leading aircraftman James L. Loveless, on New Year's Eve. Both are serving in Holland.
Here at Eindhoven, Bud's brother Jim Loveless worked as an Air Force mechanic and had been overseas for some time before his younger brother Bud arrived. On New Year's Eve, the brothers reunited, seeing each other for the first time since the early years of the war. Jim, with a group of Air Force buddies, noticed a silhouette of an airman approaching from the distance. With a distinct walk, the result of a car accident 2 years before, Jim recognized his brother instantly.
waited for the mate that fate had me created.
New Year's, 1944. I'm flying from the airdrome in Holland where Jim is stationed. We were sure glad to see each other, and we had some real long talks. He's certainly looking well and has been doing a great job over here. We spent New Year's Eve together. We'll have the Jerry's licked by spring. I can't see how he stopped completely on these major attacks, and believe me, he is throwing everything he has left into these.
The brothers enjoyed a night of revelry, celebrating the holidays and welcoming in the year 1945, hoping that next New Year's would be celebrated back home at the DeLauro Hall. The brothers, no doubt soothing sore heads, would have a rude start to 1945 as the Germans, on January 1st, launched Operation Bodenplatte. Delayed repeatedly by poor weather, the operation was an attempt by the Luftwaffe to cripple Allied air forces in Europe's Low Countries, including the Netherlands.
On the morning of January 1st, 1945, at approximately 0920 hours, I was in the Air Force truck with 5 other officers on our way from the mess to our squadron flight. We just reached the field when enemy aircraft suddenly appeared at very low level, strafing everything in sight. We flattened on the floor of the truck until the first wave flew past, and then we jumped for safety into a ditch. The attack lasted for 20-30 minutes. I was not able to step on my left foot when it was over. Pilot Officer F.R. Loveless.
Operation Bodenplatte is largely seen as a failure. The many Allied aircraft destroyed on the ground were quickly replaced. Casualties among Allied aircrew were quite small. The Germans, however, lost many pilots, including the few remaining pilots with any experience to speak of. 14 Squadron had also suffered the loss of 2 airmen, with several others wounded, including Bud Loveless.
Flyer fractures heel in jump from truck, Marmara, January 25th. Flying Officer Floyd Russell is in hospital in Brussels with a fractured heel caused when he bailed out of a truck in Holland. His injury occurred January the 1st, and admission to hospital took place 4 days later. This information was contained in a letter received by his parents from their other son in the Air Force, James Loveless.
The 414 Squadron, also known unofficially as the Sarnia Imperials, or the Black Knight Squadron. Their motto, Totus Vibiris, with all our might. The squadron badge includes a knight riding a horse over a cloud, the knight representing fair but mortal combat, the cloud indicating that the 414 Squadron takes their fight to the skies. Bud wouldn't be completely unprotected in the skies over Europe. Watching his back was a fully armed wingman who was assigned to each reconnaissance flight. And it was under the watchful eye of Wingman Flight Lieutenant Leslie Banner that Bud would return to the skies after a 6-week hospital stay in Brussels following the January 1st attack. Photo reconnaissance Spitfires used a variety of camera configurations, including one mounted on a pod under each wing, and 3 set up in the fuselage behind the pilot. The most common British cameras used for reconnaissance flights were known as the F-8, the F-24, and the F-52. By 1945, it was widely recognized that air reconnaissance was a crucial component of the Allied push towards Berlin. Although bombs, bullets, and rockets were unleashed on the enemy during the Second World War, it was often the camera that proved most deadly. Bud would have the honor of serving with other wingmen during his reconnaissance time, including Flight Lieutenants Bill Sawyer, Douglas Sammy Hall, Robert James Cutting, and Squadron Leader James Bernard Prendergast. Early spring, the Allied crossings of the Rhine River allowed U.S. and British troops to advance rapidly into the interior of Germany, helping to bring about the defeat of the Third Reich. Bud and his photo reconnaissance squadron played a role in these crucial advancements, providing photos of enemy movements and placements. In the multiple missions Bud and his wingman flew over this active battleground, they had many close calls, with flak being shot at them, to the point where the wingman had to strafe the enemy targets in order to avoid being hit. On March 17, 1945, Bud and his wingman Bill Sawyer, another Canadian flying in 414 Squadron, were called upon for another photo reconnaissance mission. The pair's objective: capture photos and note any activity over the skies of Wesel, Germany. Bud was in good hands. Bill Sawyer had, just months prior, bagged 3 enemy Me-109s and damaged 2. The pair were about to abort the mission due to poor visibility, when suddenly the skies opened up with German flak. Bill Sawyer's aircraft was disabled after being hit multiple times, leaving Bud completely unprotected in the skies over Germany. As a reconnaissance aircraft, Bud's Spitfire was armed only with a camera. Despite it being a harrowing mission, the 2 Canadians miraculously made it back to the safety of their airfield, B-90 in Belgium. Amongst the daring missions in early 1945, Bud reunited with his hometown buddy, Mac Reeves of Madoc. Oddly enough, Bud's 39 Recce Wing had recently shifted operations to B-90 Petit Brogel Airfield in Belgium, the same airfield out of which his hometown buddy Mac was stationed with 403 Squadron. The pair hadn't seen each other since receiving their wings at Uplands in Ottawa 2 years earlier. Like Bud, Mac was eager to return home to rural life in Hastings County, Ontario. The 2 best friends made a pact that if either of them were to be killed in action, the other would take on the unpleasant role of notifying the family. 10 days later, one of the 2 men would be called upon to hold up his end of the bargain, and it would haunt Bud Loveless for the rest of his life.
Yeah, they've been through everything together. That was the only part that Bud had trouble talking about was, and you could just relive it. The next day he's back up, just like turn the page.
Bud's 414 Squadron was relocated to Airfield B-104 near Wesel, Germany, territory recently captured by the Allied forces. It's believed the reconnaissance squadron was one of the first, if not the first group of Canadian Air Force members to cross the Rhine. The remainder of the squadron stayed at the previous location until the airfield was fully serviceable. Reconnaissance aircraft were unarmed for two reasons. One, to avoid the additional weight, which would decrease the performance of the aircraft. And two, to discourage pilots from engaging the enemy, rather than focusing on getting the valuable photographic intelligence that they'd been tasked with bringing back. On the 7th of April 1945, in a fierce battle with German troops, British forces, many parachuting in from above, seized control of Wunstorf Airfield, 300 kilometers west of Berlin. During the battle, the Allies suffered the loss of 6 men, with another 21 wounded, most of them during the initial ambush. Among the captured loot at Wunstorf Airfield were 27 German aircraft, including 23 of the much-feared Messerschmitt 109s and Focke-Wulf 190s. After the battle, the Royal Air Force, including Canadian airmen, moved operations onto the captured base, which became known as Advanced Landing Ground Wunstorf. Within 10 days, Bud and his reconnaissance crew would be up and running at Wunstorf. As the final push continued, the Allied noose quickly tightening around the necks of the desperate enemy. As the final chapters of the Second World War were coming to a close, the number of operations being conducted by Allied air squadrons were staggering and included Bud's 414 Squadron, busy collecting images of enemy movements and targets. Bud was conducting his 28th sortie of April, sent on a mission with his squadron leader, J.B. Prendergast. On this April 20th mission, over Hamburg and Harnburg in Germany, Prendergast was flying his famous Spitfire, Lazy Lady 4, NH-648.
On April 20th, on the day of this particular mission, Bud Loveless and myself took off to do a harbor reconnaissance of Harburg and Hamburg along the north coast of Germany, checking particularly for any submarine activity, as Hamburg had been one of the main points of embarkation for submarines during the entire war.
After departing Wunstorf Airfield, Squadron Leader Prendergast and I made contact after 30 minutes. We checked intact Hamburg bridges. We observed 1 destroyer, 1 merchant ship, 2,000 tons, and as well as 15 vessels ranging from 500 tons. We sighted gun positions, bridges, and tanks were also noted during this operation.
The Spitfire was never designed to parachute out of it. They told you how to do it, but it was something that you never practiced, because they're not going to sacrifice an aircraft to. But they just basically handed you a manual and said, "This is the way you do it. You get rid of your cockpit."
There's no practice.
No, and if you have power, if you can flip the aircraft upside down, that's to your advantage. But a lot of guys would get caught in the back wing, so you got to dive. You got to get rid of your canopy and kind of roll back, and then you got to dive down below the back wing or you'll get hung up on that. So he bailed and never parachuted in his life. Just it's part of your seat, right? And pulled the chute, and he's coming down, and he said he could see the Germans coming in. There was like a Jeep, and there was a motorcycle, like a BMW with a sidecar. And he said it was just like a cartoon. He said, my feet were running before he hit the ground. And as soon as he hit the ground, he pulled that chute. And he landed on the edge of a field, and there was a forest very close to there. And he starts running towards the forest. All he had was a sidearm. He carried a .38 Colt Special. That was a sidearm. That's all he had. And he was running, and the Germans were coming in, and they started shooting. And he said he could feel the concussion from one of the bullets going past him. He said, "That's it. I'm done. There's enough of this." So they come up, and like I said, there wasn't a whole lot of them. He said there was like maybe 3 or 4 of them. Speak any German, and they didn't speak any English. They wanted him to drop his sidearm, and they hit him over the head with a machine gun, knocked him out.
Floyd, wake up. Come home to me.
Took his sidearm, and he woke up. He was in the sidecar of this motorcycle.
R.J. Cutting, Witness Report. On April 24th, 1945, I was leading a selection of Spitfire Mark 14s on a mission to Neumünster, comprised of myself and Flying Officer Loveless. When about 20 miles north of Hamburg, Flying Officer Loveless informed me that his engine had quit. While he was trying to get it to pick up, he informed me that he was on fire, and about the same time, I saw a sheet of flame which appeared to come from his starboard radiator. This was followed by black smoke, and I told him to bail out, which he did at approximately 5,000 feet, his aircraft exploding shortly before it hit the ground. He landed safely at pinpoint south 592820, and on the diving to the deck, I saw him picked up by 4 civilians, one of whom appeared to be an Allied uniform of some sort. Flying Officer Loveless waved to me as I went by, and I then returned to base. Flight Lieutenant R.J. Cutting, 414 Squadron, RCAF, April 29, 1945.
April 28, 1945. Today, I was not prepared for the knock at the door. I've dreaded this moment ever since Bud joined up. I was busy baking for a church fundraiser for the war effort when there was a knock at the door. I knew when I saw the postmaster with that envelope that it was bad news. It was a telegram telling me that Floyd, my dear Floyd, is missing in action. Somehow, I just know that Bud is out there and alive, and I have faith that Bud is safe somewhere over there. I'm completely lost for words, but I must inform Harry and Beatrice about this awful news. My faith will carry me through this nightmare.
So this was getting close to the end of the war, and the spirit, I think, of the Germans' fight was pretty much gone at that point. So they kind of looked at Bud as kind of like a trophy, a Spitfire pilot. We just shot him down. They took him into Hamburg, Germany, and took him to a bar and showed him off and fed him beer. So then they took him from there, and he went to a POW camp just north of Hamburg, Germany. And he said he was treated very well. He had no complaints about, there was no Taj Mahal, but for the conditions, right?
This is where Bud underwent interrogation at the Stalaz interrogation camp. Bud did not meet any local men during his time at the camp. Some were from Ottawa and others from Toronto. The only form of recreation allowed was walking.
April 29, 1945. Dear Mrs. Loveless, before you receive this letter, you will have had a cable informing you that your husband, Flying Officer Floyd Russell Loveless, J44245, has been reported missing as a result of air operations. It is with deep regret that I write to you to convey to Bud's family the feelings of the entire squadron. On April 24th at 10 a.m., Bud took off from our base, flying as number 2 to Flight Lieutenant R.J. Cutting. This section had been detailed to carry out a tactical reconnaissance mission behind the enemy lines in Germany. Flight Lieutenant Cutting orbited around him as he dropped to the ground with his parachute working perfectly. Bud landed safely and was last seen gathering up his parachute. At the time, I was flying myself, so overheard the conversation and greatly admired Bud's coolness. During the time Bud has been with the squadron, he has been a tremendous asset, at all times being most cheery and showing a great keenness in his work. Up until the time of his accident, he had completed successfully 42 operational sorties for a total of 61 hours and 40 minutes. I sincerely hope that shortly you will hear favorable news of Bud from Air Ministry. May I now express the great sympathy which all of us, both his fellow officers and the airmen of the squadron, feel with you in your anxiety. You may well be proud of him, for no pilot could fulfill more adequately his duty to the service and his country than did your husband. Yours faithfully, J.B. Prendergast, Squadron Leader, Officer Commanding 414 Squadron, RCAF.
This proved to be his only place of detention, as 14 days later, the victorious invading army released the flyer and fellow prisoners.
They commandeered this Mercedes-Benz from this lady, young girl, and the back seat, it was a convertible Mercedes, and the back seat was full of bicycle tires. Her and her father had like a bicycle shop, and they had sprockets and chains and all kinds of bicycle parts and tires and stuff. So, but I mean, he said I felt bad enough about stealing her car. At least I could do was leave her bicycle parts. So he took her to her house there, and they needed the room for the guys to sit anyway, so they had to clean the seats out. So they take the bicycle parts down to the basement of her house, and here's 9 German officers sitting around the basement. One of them was the commandant from the POW camp, which had just been liberated, right? So they just wanted to get the hell out of there. They didn't want any conflict or things, but they did disarm them. And all those photographs, all the trophies there, the Schmeiser, the Walther, are both in that photo.
You think Bud was set up or baited?
He thought about that many times, but he said they put up very little resistance. So the POW camp was just liberated by the Russians. I think that these Germans, knowing the Germans, they were thankful that these were Americans and Brits. When the 4 of them come out of the basement now with all these arms, they got the Mercedes. They got these guys are doing pretty good. They're well armed. They got a new Benz. They're on their way back to Belgium. And here's all the Russians. They're on foot. Bud said it was a big POW camp, and there was about 400 Russians in that camp. The Russians are all on their way into Hamburg. They want to cause havoc. They want to rape the women. They want to burn the town. They want to do what Russians did. Bud had the machine gun at that time. He just ripped 21 rounds a second across the dirt. He didn't speak Russian. They didn't speak English, but they got the message pretty quick. So the Russians started marching back towards Russia. Bud got in the Benz with his buddies and hightailed her back to Brussels.
The Ottawa Journal, Thursday, June 14th, 1945. Take over Nazi Otto. After their prisoner of war camp had been liberated by 2 Army dispatch riders, these 4 airmen took over a Mercedes-Benz automobile, gathered up their guards' weapons, and headed back to an RCAF airfield. Left to right, they are Flying Officer T.C. King, Ottawa, Flight Lieutenant W.A. Wilson of Vancouver, Flying Officer F.R. Loveless, Marmora and Deloro, Ontario, and Flight Lieutenant D.A. Labour of Yorkshire, England.
And they drove the Mercedes back to Belgium, and by that time, basically, it's 1945 now, the war's pretty much over, and Bud never saw any action after that. That was pretty much it.
German radio has just announced that Hitler is dead.
May 5th was a rather eventful day. Bud Loveless had gone missing shortly after we had our mission on April 20th. He returned to the unit after having been a POW for 2 weeks. We celebrated appropriately, and shortly afterwards, we moved to B156 Lüneburg.
Hello out there, Canadian forces. As the news came through that official word would likely be received in the next 24 hours that Germany had surrendered unconditionally.
At 1 minute after midnight tonight, Tuesday, the 8th of May, we may allow ourselves a brief period of rejoicing. Today is Victory in Europe Day. Tomorrow will also be Victory in Europe Day. But let us not forget for a moment the toils and efforts that lie ahead.
Shortly after being reunited with his squadron, Bud was flown back from Brussels to Bournemouth. He was delighted to return to the charming seaside resort where he had first commenced his duties in England a year prior.
June 29th, 1945. I've recently arrived in Bournemouth after being released as a prisoner of war. During my almost 2 years overseas, I've escaped death multiple times on more than one occasion, but I am sure thankful to be alive. I'm currently at the No. 3 RCAF Personal Recreational Center in Bournemouth, surrounded with other recently released prisoners of war. FLT McCaig was a Spitfire pilot as well, shot down over France and was part of the construction of the Great Escape, but transferred before the tragic day. Charles Bullock was shot down in a Halifax bomber and has been a prisoner of war since the release. James Russell was shot down as well, one of 2 survivors of the crew of 7 Canadians. As we have been well taken care of in the hands of a Red Cross nurse of Miss Joan McKee Mitchell, completing our Red Cross questionnaires. I am sure looking forward to making my way back home to Canada.
May 11th, 1945. Today a telegram came saying that Bud is alive and back with his squadron. I can't wait to tell all of our friends and family about this great news. What a welcome home it will be when he finally gets back to Marmora.
Royal Canadian Air Force Chaplain Services, May 29, 1945. Dear Mrs. Loveless, knowing how anxious you have been about your husband, Floyd Russell Loveless, I thought you would appreciate a note from one who had the pleasure of welcoming and chatting with him on his safe arrival in England. You'll be glad to know that he looks very well and is in excellent spirits. His one concern at the moment is to get back home as quickly as he can, and our own people are doing everything they can to see that he does. You and the grand reunion that will soon be yours are uppermost in his mind. We owe a debt of gratitude, not only to your husband, but to you also, for all that has been endured during these dark days. I join with you in thanksgiving to God for Floyd's deliverance. May he continue to abundantly bless both of you. Sincerely yours, Squadron Leader F.G. Ongley, chaplain, RCAF, overseas.
The Ottawa Journal, Monday, August 27, 1945. Ottawa girl conducts Red Cross questionnaire. Liberated RCAF prisoners of war fill in a Canadian Red Cross food parcel questionnaire over cups of coffee in their canteen at the Bournemouth Reception Centre. Left to right are Flight Lieutenant C.H. Bullock, DFM of Lachine, Quebec, Flight Lieutenant James C. Russell, Toronto, Flying Officer F.R. Loveless, Deloro, Ontario, Mrs. Alex Mitchell, Canada Red Cross Corps.
Bud boarded RMS Stratheden on July 22nd after serving overseas for 2 years. The 23,000-ton troop ship departed the English port of Liverpool for the long journey back to Canada. Nine days later, on July 31st, 1945, the bells of Quebec City rang out when the Stratheden was spotted 5 miles downstream near the island of Orleans. All of the churches in the city loudly welcomed home the 5,000 airmen and soldiers aboard the troop ship, including Bud Loveless. The Stratheden dropped anchor in Quebec City's Wolf Cove, the first troop ship to do so since World War I. Due to its afternoon arrival, the passengers were kept on board until the following morning.
All aboard!
And that's when Bud jumped on a westbound train for home.
On July 30th, Harry Loveless received the good news that his son, Flying Officer Floyd Loveless, had landed at Quebec from overseas. Bud looks good and is glad to be home. Looking forward to a visit some afternoon, Bud.
Behind this planned rehabilitation lies the rousing welcome of a nation of brothers and friends. Canadians with a warm desire to welcome back and speedily resettle the men who have fought in the front line of battle. The soldiers' return challenges all of us to carry out this great program with eagerness and warmth, to say to the men and women who have come back from the wars, welcome, soldier, the mat's out. This is home.
With the war complete, after many courageous missions, flights, near misses, imprisonment, and tense encounters, Bud returned home in the summer of 1945, anxious to reunite with friends, family, and especially his wife Rita. Following his service, Bud worked for a short time at General Electric in Peterborough, carefully saving money so he and Rita could purchase their own business. They did exactly that a couple of years later, in 1947, when Bud and Rita became the owners of the Red and White store in Marmora. They changed the name to Loveless Groceries and Meats and served Marmora and area for 28 years. Dave Loveless worked at his uncle's store for 2 years.
The store ran like a machine, because you'd have Rita at the front, who knew everything, where everything was, and blah, blah, blah. Bud at the back, and he didn't cross paths. Like, they stayed in their own little domain, and that's basically where they were. He worked so hard. He'd be up at 4:30, 4 to 5 in the morning. He'd be up at the cutting meat probably by just about daylight, and he'd work there till 7:30, 8 o'clock at night some nights, and I don't know how he did it. Like, I really, he wasn't a big man, but he was feisty, and I'll tell you, it was a tremendous amount of work he'd do in a day.
Bud spent the remainder of his life in the area, embracing the outdoors as an avid hunter, fisher, sports enthusiast, and family man, all while running a successful grocery store and butcher shop in town and on Crow Lake. Rita and Bud carved out a good life in Marmora for their 3 children, Tim, Mary, and Gina. Tim Black says his father-in-law was also an avid gardener, well known for his rose bushes. Bud was a frequent barbecuer, and he and Rita enjoyed entertaining at their home, where music was always involved. Coincidentally, the Loveless home, which was just a block away from their thriving grocery store and butcher shop, was just around the corner from where Bud's fallen war buddy, Mac Reeves, ran a gas station for 5 years before the war. I'm sure if Mac made it out alive, the two would have remained close pals, meals and barbecues and stories about their days with the Royal Canadian Air Force, flying one of the best fighter planes in the world, the Spitfire. As a testament to Bud's determination, he fought a long, hard battle with cancer before losing his life in 1990. The love of his life, Rita Johnson, passed away in 2002. But their passing certainly does not end the story of the Loveless family. One grandson, Justin, who looks strikingly similar to Bud, shares a special bond to a grandfather who he barely knew. A strong passion for hunting, fishing, and outdoors are embedded in his family blood. And Bud's son-in-law, Tim Black, was one of the few fortunate ones with whom Bud opened up and shared his first-hand war experiences. Tim's knowledge of Bud's extraordinary heroics will ensure that his stories will be preserved for many generations to come.
This is a story about a father, a grandfather, an athlete, an avid outdoorsman, and most of all, an unsung hero. Floyd Russell Loveless.